Thanks, Michael, and great to be here, and thanks to the New America Foundation for this opportunity to discuss our work. Can everybody hear me? What we'll do is present our argument, and I'll start by outlining some of the arguments, and Dan will talk about policy implications and international implications for our piece. But we really start with a observation that in the last several years there's been a new vision, if you will, appearing among policy analysts and scholars of international relations about the future, about the nature of conflict and the coming cleavages in world politics, and in particular a view that there is a coming return of great power politics, that there is a rising new division between great powers. Robert Kagan and other neoconservatives have put forward in particular the view of a autocratic revival, that is to say, the return of non-liberal states to power and prominence, and thereby triggering troubles that the United States has to respond to. In particular, China and Russia are seen as pioneering a new type of authoritarian capitalism, a different pathway to a new pathway to modernity, a non-liberal, authoritarian capitalist pathway. These autocratic capitalist states, China and Russia, are not like the old autocratic states of an earlier era, in the sense that they are more adaptive, more resilient. They have found ways to work with capitalism, but they are like the old autocratic states in that they are hostile to the West. They have non-liberal ambitions and have their own vision, if you will, of order and deep reservations about integration and cooperation with the West. They even appear in some renderings to have the makings of a coalition, really, of autocratic coalition. The Shanghai Cooperation Council is an example of that. Conflict is further exacerbated by oil and energy scramble, that there are new scarcities that are triggering competition, great power competition. And in the case of Russia and China, again, other aspects exacerbate this coming conflict, namely, in the case of Russia, the humiliation of losing its empire and the resentments and arguments against the West that have ensued from its failures at the end of the Cold War. And in the case of China, a century of humiliation and its own grievances about the earlier imperial period and its attempt to assert itself in the wake of all of that. Robert Kagan has developed this position characteristically with great clarity and provocative expression. In his view, Russia and China are ushering in a return to a kind of 19th century order, a return to the great power politics of that century, a new divide, as we said, between autocratic and democratic states. And this position that he has made prominent has filtered into the political arena, and during the campaign you will of course remember McCain's proposal for a League of Democracies. The argument there is that in the context of this coming division among the great powers, the autocratic revival, the prescription for the West, and certainly for the United States, is to circle the wagons and gird up your democratic loins and prepare for that kind of division of the world. Now, in the background, this return to debate about modernity and the direction of great power political development is really a return to what you might call the great contest, or the big debate that has been really shadowing foreign policy and political debates for 2 centuries. In some ways, the debate about the autocratic revival is a return to the debate about what kinds of states are most adaptive, what kinds of states are vanguard states that have within their structures the ability to modernize and be the kind of cutting edge of of modernization. This is a debate that has been going on since the late 18th century. The question has been debated. What is the political system that is most viable given industrialism? And since the 19th century, the debate has really been between liberals, starting with Adam Smith, and non-liberal theorists who have argued that other kinds of non-liberal democratic states have the advantages and the kind of adaptive capacities that propel them into the future. During the 20th century, there were really three big rival positions or models, if you will, among the great powers. There were the liberal states of the West, there were the communist states and autocratic fascist states in Germany and Japan. With the end of World War II, the great debate was really between liberalism and communism. And then in 1989, the end of the Cold War, there was the widely held view that the debate ended. That we had now come to the point where it was clear from history and world political development that the liberal position and the model that it articulated was the winner. We come today really with the new realization that the debate has been reopened, and the debate is again between the liberal view about the capacities of liberal democratic states and autocratic capitalist states. Now, you'll note that the debate has narrowed, that even the challenger position that is seen to be adaptive and resilient is itself a capitalist state. China and Russia are working inside of world capitalist society. They are taking advantage of it. And the question is there a sustainable model that is embedded in one or both of these states that leads us to believe that there is a ongoing structural basis for a kind of division of the world based on multiple modernities. Now, our position, and Dan will talk more about this in a few minutes when I pass the baton to him, but our position is that this autocratic revival thesis is exaggerated and largely mistaken, that these states, these autocratic capitalist states, are not a sustainable alternative, that they are on a pathway that is maybe a long pathway, but one that will take them through capitalist development and political development into the world that the liberal West inhabits. We go in detail about these issues because it's important to talk about these kinds of mechanisms that are forcing adaptation and reform. And we talk about the incentives for liberal reform. We mentioned several of them. The growing inequality, particularly in China, but also in Russia, which is a kind of catalyst for reform, the kind of rise of division and inequality, pushing reform, as it has in the West over the centuries, as a vehicle for mobilization and political appeal. Private property, these are capitalist societies, the kind of slippery slope that begins when business law emerges and courts, and the importance and the incentive really to develop property rights and rule of law, taking you into the political realm. And then economic development itself, the staple of liberal modernization theory, that as one's society modernizes, industrializes, it develops a larger middle class, a more advanced economy, certain things happen. The nature of society itself shifts, more diversity, more pluralism, more multi-party logic of rule. Finally, in terms of the domestic constraints and incentives that shift these states forward, autocratic states are also hobbled, if you will, by the dysfunctions of a closed political system. And we talk a little bit about this. We mentioned several different features: corruption, official corruption. The China specialists that we read give great evocative detail to the dysfunctions of official corruption that goes all the way down from the center to the province. In China, Putin's ideological appeals to good behavior have not been able to overcome the kind of corruption that exists in the system. And then closed systems themselves, an old insight that liberal theorists have long emphasized, namely that you have a loss of information that's needed for making good policy decisions, and so you create social social outcomes that spur demands for reform. In the case of China, the SARS crisis, and more recently, across our newspapers, the stories of environmental problems, water shortages, all the sorts of sort of dark side of industrialism in a society that's not that has a government that isn't accountable, it isn't open and transparent, creating incentives for those sorts of movements. With that, I want to turn the podium over to Dan, who's going to talk more about the international implications of the Autocratic Revival thesis, and then bring it home with a discussion of policy implications for America.